Hello everyone, today we talk about Southern French warfare from the 11th to the 14th century for our medieval regional history of warfare series. We already covered other areas of at least the contemporary territory of France, such as, for example, the one about the Kingdom of Burgundy, Arles. We observed this already for this series as well as others. We made consistent amount of videos about Western Frankish warfare as well. Especially in the last year, I covered more about southwestern France. That is essentially what we're looking at today during this period, right? Southwestern Francia, and appreciated some from the historical region series polities that existed, of course, in this place, such as the County of Toulouse, the Duchy of Aquitaine, and more. And we have already profiled a bit the political and social reality of this country. It is quite complex, right? And sometimes it is given as, say, if not a compact area, in a, say, political sense. Of course, there was a high degree of fragmentation in spite of the, say, of the rise of Aquitanian power, the intermittent rise and fall of Aquitanian power in medieval French history. And that, however, is presented also in a cultural sense. And this is in part a mistake, because there were lots of influences that we will appreciate today in different areas of the country. The north, it's a vast area, right? Itself, there is a very strong Visigothic and Islamic influence historically. In this area, there is, of course, a French one, Northern French one, French proper. From the north, you do have similarities with the Italian communes. In certain cases, you have generally exposure to the Crusades from the Mediterranean, and also, of course, a Far East, at least as far as medieval Europe is concerned. Military influence as well. We'll appreciate, especially today, because in this series the purpose is not highlighting, say, the basic type of warfare that definitely for southwestern France at this point fits in the broader Western European, say, Frankish one at that point, that I discuss generally in multiple videos about Western European warfare, and arms and armor, etc. So we will see in part this series is about arms and armor, right? Because we give a broader intro about essentially this country's cultures, and then observe various archaeological, iconographic evidence to observe some interesting influence. However, on this basis from the external, which for this land, again, at the frontier between, again, the Empire, the Languedoc, the Spain, broadly meant, so with all the influences coming from there, the Mediterranean, etc., definitely has a very interesting profile and very specific characteristics that at a point do highlight also what is evident throughout this period in a broader civilization sense, that is the fact that this area was eventually overrun by the Northern French, and that part of the reason for this is that it had not acquired a political compaction, because in part it was also a more culturally shaded area than we usually think. Occitania, the Languedoc, etc., they are all an important identity that also goes across this territory further east, as we observed in other videos already. But at the same time, you have even very different institutional cultures. Think about the monasteries, lordships of Auvergne, or the more kind of northern, say, influencing county of Anjou, or the Aquitaine in its great courtly and princely power, the county and commune of Toulouse. You have Gascony in the southwest. So it's really a much more composite reality that eventually is overrun by a much more imperial rather than monarchic just, and I made lots of videos about this topic specifically, French one that eventually molded this country over the centuries into essentially a French, a process of Francization. That, however, in fact, came after a very long time of substantial detachment from the Frankish north, right? And so more this kind of Visigothic legacy, the Iberian influences, etc. So this region, of course, is taken to include all the what was, in a political and formal sense, still the old kingdom of France, right? That included these territories nominally from the Carolingian partitions, south of the river Loire. For our video, of course, that's the main geographical barrier between the north and the south, and most, of course, is what is now known as the French Midi, the south. So the regions east of the Rhone we have already seen in the other video dedicated to that, because they form part of the Kingdom of Burgundy / Arles, and they pertain thus to another culture on their own. It's not just because they were a part of the Holy Roman Empire institutionally, it's just they also had, even as Occitanians, a slightly different background, right? And the area under consideration, therefore, as we were saying before, consists of this enormous Duchy of Aquitaine. At least the Duchy itself was just a part of this territory, not even so big, telling you the truth, but of course it's an Aquitanian power that mostly hegemonizes the entire region. At a point, you have the Lesser Duchy of Gascony, again, various smaller counties and marquisates, right, all with their very peculiar history, but also with this overall great difficulty of sticking together as a unitary power from a political administrative point of view. They're fairly rich areas. They are surely different. They have a greater written tradition than the north, notoriously. They are famous for the arts, music, the great lyrical and epic and courtly chivalric production that at this time definitely does incarnate this sort of looser, let's say, political tie with one another, so greater autonomy locally. That is used to it has a higher per capita wealth, right? But in this sense, it's also less compact than the great feudal empire of the north. So by the mid-11th century, these lands had definitely their own distinctive culture, language. They had fundamentally said not to jug caput historically, because in theory, again, the system as a Western Frankish kingdom had to work unitarily, but say mostly for the claustrophobic situation, say of the Capetian dynasty for the first couple of centuries under focus here, that basically saw the Western Frankish monarch struggling just to come out of the Ile-de-France as a political territorial actor. You have a great, again, autonomy, since that this was another country, right? It's beautiful, by the way. I visited it multiple times. There are you can breathe a bit that air of even of Spain. You understand that sort of echo of or atmosphere of even the much more far away Andalusia and say the closeness to the Mediterranean is something. It's part of these landscapes as much as in the Occitanian language. But if you look as we look today, also in the military traditions at this time. During the mid-12th century, almost all this region, except for the county of Toulouse, fell under the control of the Count of Anjou. And Henry, Count of Anjou, was essentially Henry the Second, King of England, as a result of which I made a video some time ago about the Angevin empires as an introduction, and and also one about the county of Anjou, as well as these other polities individually. So this broader south, this broader Midi, soon formed part of a huge Angevin empire spreading literally from Scotland to the Spanish border. Right, this was the dream of, also later sovereigns, right, to reunite. Just recently we talked about, Spanish projects of reconquest of England, and or the possibility of, sending both to the French, to the English throne, etc. This is also a bit the theme of the 100 Years' War that we will touch today as well. Perhaps inevitably, the French monarchy felt bound to break this realm, right? There is a lot of archetypal stereotype about this, right? That the French North, that is this brutal, cold, virile, hierarchical, authoritative, militarized system that, say, penetrates and captures this florid, feminine, say, sensual, hot-tempered South, right? And obviously wins, because the idea is that, again, the waves of Indo-European conquerors that always push south and rejuvenate the race, to re-inject, let's say, this pneuma in the Pelasgian culture. You wouldn't be surprised how even artistically evident some of this is, right? Just think about the spiritual, light-like, ethereal Gothic style compared to the much bulkier Romanesque. It was still here, and that then eventually had become a bit like the symbol, together with other things. Think about the Albigensians, the Catters. We will talk about them, while their ideology, what it actually was about, right, and how the French and the popes managed to bring this power down in a broader, imperially traditional fashion, and also in an incredibly brutal yet ultimately successful one, right? The southwest of France had always had to defend its own autonomy in this regard. They had already been fighting since, Carolingian, Merovingian times for this, and at this point, the medieval revival, say the High Middle Ages specifically, brought newly those two cultures to clash against one another, right? Between 1180 and the outbreak of the 100 Years' War in 1337, the kings of France succeeded in fact reducing this southern French territory controlled by English Angevin monarchs to the southern Saintonge and western Gascony that remain, in fact, in the hands of the English also up to very late. But still, of course, in the feudal and traditional fashion, they were purely French, purely Occitanian, actually. That, of course, unimportant. It's unthoughtful of me to speak like, to make these lapses. So meanwhile, the reduction of this, so say in bracket, English control in northern France was even more dramatic. Meanwhile, southern France, and above all the county of Toulouse, had suffered the full effects of the Albigensian Crusade. The Albigensians were these heretics, essentially Manichaeans, that had spread as a sect throughout different areas of Europe from the Mediterranean, and they were actually the say medieval version just of, again, beliefs that existed from millennia, right, and that the Indo-Europeans had always been ruthlessly and rightly, I would add, fighting again, because it was denying the possibility, in fact, of the resurrection of the flesh, like mortificate. They were essentially, if you look at them, they were vegans. They hated sex. They denied that kind of biological. That does it remind you of anything, right? Except, of course, they, while criticizing Rome, because they were trying essentially to say, here, it's an incredibly complex topic. Made several videos about the Catter, so I don't want to make it too simplistic. but they were trying to escape the pressure of the northern French that had the papal blessing, and so they were also, say, surfing the wave of the evangelic papistic movements, many of which were heretical against Rome, except they literally copied the entire papal monarchic system, including they had their own inquisition, etc. So actually, what, say, most even heretical and let's say heterodox fringes, for example, the Valdensians, as they were persecuted by the papacy, were fully okay with the extermination of the Cathars, and actually most Christians perfectly were, because objectively it was insanity, and of course it lost, right? Because evil always does. Yet not without a fight in this case, because also many people that fought from the side, say, of the Albigensians, for how they were also a bit, stereotyped as a whole, were actually perfect Catholic Christians. They didn't really care about Catharism nor etc. But again, it was a matter of political interest. The Counts of Toulouse had relations. They were married into the Counts of Catalonia. As you know, the King of Aragon is killed at Muret. You find, lots of this kind of international involvement of these areas, because that's how interconnected they really were, and how strategic they were becoming, especially for France and especially the northeastern Iberian powers. So the Albigensians' activities made them the target of the brutal crusade of the early 13th century. And as we will see now, militarily-wise, this, of course, brought to a great increase of northern French military influence in Occitania. The military styles of the Midi were not practically different from the ones of the north. I mean, we want to appreciate what a civilization is in the capacity of which northern France became an actual empire, and how, and what mechanisms were triggered there in order to make it so. And again, I have a medieval France playlist. You can find lots of stuff about this. The south, as we've seen, was more fragmented, so that's not a good moral and political indicator, because political division, it means weakness at every level. But we're looking at, in fact, the High Middle Ages. We're looking at a period in which, yes, you can have this divides in somehow political compaction, etc., but the technological or social differences, this pre-industrial world, are pretty scarce overall. So while, as we'll see now, there are differences from the north, of course, the local warfare was pretty much the same. Otherwise, in northern France, based on the, again, essentially on a feudal culture, less developed as feudalism proper than the north, were more communes that also were, however, not fully developed, like, say, the Italian ones in the profile of a city-state, because they were, in fact, a sort of hybrid still with a feudal system, right? And that was also not good for them at this point. But again, like everywhere in Western Europe, you have, except from the fringes, let's say, feudal, heavily armored cavalry supported by a substantial amount of infantry forces that are also well equipped, definitely well armed, in some cases also well trained, and, say, foot troops, as you know, in the Middle Ages are somehow overlooked in one sense, especially in terms of technical culture, also the wealth of their equipment and so on, and also in the interaction with cavalry, as opposed to make the story that the commoner fights the knight, right? That is not exactly what often really was the point, even if somebody we had some instances against one, because the vertical divides were at times, like in this case, much bigger than the say the horizontal ones, right? Or the other way around, depending how you pictured that. In any case, this in turn, like there was an excess of private war, definitely in this country as well, due to the political fragmentation. because the local nobility was a bit habituated to just do whatever they liked. They didn't have a major overlord, right? And as such, this is the downside, of course, of not having a political compaction. Let's say this world was somehow more permeable, less ordered, less disciplined from the above, and this, of course, is a serious military issue, culturally speaking. This had, of course, like in other areas of Europe, prompted an early development of the so-called peace of God movement among, especially the non-noble estates. So the idea is that the peace of God, the truth of God, is a sort of negotiation for, say, avoiding to fight in certain places on certain times, and to, say, generally speaking, a discipline, like channeling violence towards more rewarding enterprises, such as the Crusades, right? And you know that the Counts of Toulouse had an important involvement also outre-mer in the Levant, in the Holy Land. The turbulent milites, the Latin name for knights of the medieval Europe, in this region also played a leading role in the Iberian reconquest. After all, we're just across the Pyrenees, so when we look at the French, say, overall, it's a bit simplified, like the sense of French knights that arrived from the north to support the Spanish, the Christian Spanish against the Moors of the south. We have to account that lots of them were Occitanians, if anything, for reasons of geographical proximity. And there were people coming literally from everywhere. But there is, of course, a strong connection. And I'm not talking about little movements here, but literally, as generally speaking, we tend to underestimate criminally human mobility throughout history and how easy it actually was for moving even as far as southern Spain for a raid, right? If you had the right company for doing so, and a bit of capacity and a bit of luck, well, you, as we'll see now, you have really a lot of indicators, a lot of even artistically vivid imagery that was taken by the Occitanians in order to depict the Moors, and in part also to adopt some of, not necessarily their style in a broader sense. Some of these lands up to the 11th century were actually occupied by Muslim forces. Think about Fraxinetum, etc. And the point being, in this sense, that the Midi was somehow less heavy in general than northern France as far as fighting styles were concerned, because when you have less feudalism, you also have less peak of, at least, like, of armoredness, less you have say a more evenly distributed wealth that brings overall to say the population to be a bit better armed, and say the elite to be slightly less armed. Right? On average, I'm not saying that, say, the Occitanian nobility didn't have the finest armor that could be worn even by the northern neighbors, right? But you definitely do see that the overall style of warfare, tactics, anachronistically we can say doctrine, was closer to some parts of, especially southwestern Europe, than northern France. So with lighter tactics, something that definitely does have some reminiscence of the fighting a la Hineta or stuff like that, because they were really close, right? And especially connected with that politically, economically, and more. Some say that the success of the peace of God would make the Midi neglect urban fortifications during the 12th century. So the idea is that all these warlike men had gone abroad fighting, they had not, let's say, as it would have, they normally did, right? They surely kept doing in some measure, hammering, say, the neighbors' fortresses and towns, etc. And so this would have essentially brought some sort of scarce, say, fortificatory exploit at this point, differently from other areas in Europe. I think the simplest, this can be a factor, of course, but I think that there is the bigger one, again, the lack of a centralized system, or at least one that, you know, had a concentrated power capable of, say, building, for example, bigger fortifications in strategic points. Think about what France and England do in northern France, places like Chateau Gaillard, or, you know, many other massive. Again, I made a video specifically about the cost of castle construction during the 12th and 13th century in France and England, and you realize that, of course, the south, like other areas of Europe, were as fragmented, right? This is true for Central Europe compared to northern France or England, right? Because think about countries like Castile too. That these are in the westernmost section of Europe, like the places in which there is more castle building associated to the compaction of feudal monarchies, right? Southern Italy has a lot of that too. Why? Because it was a kingdom. If it was a feudal kingdom, unlike the north, at least in that case, definitely did have a lot of urban fortifications, but not the, say, bulkier castles that you observe in other areas. So this aspect is quite fascinating, because, again, southern France was a sort of hybrid between not even a feudal system and a communal one, but not being, let's say, missing some of the best of both systems when invested in individually, exclusively at some point by the local communities. So even after the Albigensian Crusade, or perhaps in some ways because of it, mercenaries from the French Midi were still widely recorded in the 13th century. And this goes on, right? Think about the most highly regarded Gascon infantry. Actually, they were, you know, nothing dramatically advanced. I mean, it's just like the among Alvarez in Spain, or, I don't know, other mercenaries. Think about the Welsh, you know, in the armies of the English armies of the 100 Years' War. These men went out there because their country, of course, after the Albigensian Crusade had entered a crisis. They were poor, and so more of them would join this military lifestyle, right? Because they had not much to lose anymore. This is true also, as we said now, for example, why did the Welsh, why were lots of Welsh archers in English armies of the 100 Years' War? Because the Welsh were actually, as some still think, after, you know, tons of historiography proving you otherwise, they were anything better, or for that matter, anything worse than the English archers. No, right? They were pretty much the same, aside from certain historiographical exaggerations or specific episodes that people think have generalized structural significance to. Absolutely not, right? And part of the reason these troops were, in fact, so present is that they were also relatively cheaper, right? These weren't the highly costly and specialized and heavy, I don't know, French, Burgundian, German mercenaries that are hired in consistent numbers of size of armies by some, I don't know, Italian lordship, etc. These are just, and say they're prevalently infantry, for example. They are great scorchers. They are definitely good at light infantry. They have a bit of everything into them. There is also heavy cavalry, of course, but overall, right, they are that type of force that is good because it becomes professional, becomes mercenary. It means that they do this for a living. So you can have better weapons, you can have better, let's say, wishful motivation, but if you haven't been at war your entire life, you can't be a good, effective soldier. And it doesn't matter what you actually even use as a traditional fighting style. Like this sort of medium infantry with sound cavalry is still good, right? At this point, I will surely talk about Gascon infantry at some point, a bit more in depth, to understand who they really were, because it's not, again, always immediate, right, and self-evident, and why they were hired by certain powers rather than others, and so on. There's a lot going on. I personally studied this stuff as far as the Mongol Vares are concerned, especially in the Angevin and Guelph forces. In fact, from the end of the 13th to the beginning of the 14th century, because there are really lots of variations in our military systems, and these regions are mostly becoming fringe ones from which these guys go fighting to the most advanced places instead, right? So it's also somehow sad, but you do realize that there are countries that had not been particularly militarized or famous for mercenaries. Then what happens? There is a regime change, there is a collapse, a decline, a crisis, whatever. You start finding guys from there selling their military service abroad, right? Of course, medieval Europe was more militarized than modern Europe, than contemporary Europe. So you would always find somebody who was capable of fighting. But quantities, stats, rate, quality as well is important, because you can observe this movements, this phenomenon. At the same time, there were also important technical centers in southwestern France. Bordeaux, for example, was growing in importance as a center of arms production, right? Because it's a sort of well-placed city on the estuary to the Atlantic, especially because of the English connection. You have a lot of troops passing through there, so there is a florid, at least production that is immediately available for the troops. They are mostly actually Gascon, right? Even in the English, called them English chevauchés, etc. But we took a look at, for example, the army of the campaign of Poitiers, and also I made a bit about properly the organic of the English chevauchés, and we see that, of course, the majority of these forces were Gascon, and they were in fact different from the English ones to some degree, because they had this kind of lighter skirmishing nature compared more to the, also in this case, kind of gloomier, heavier, aside from the longbow and aspect of the men-at-arms of those indentures. But again, as we were saying before, it was much of a deal. Gascon men-at-arms were also that, say, brutal in their, say, broader French culture as well. You definitely see this, this wealth. The area actually would undergo a crisis in part because of the English chevauchés, so that Bordeaux is actually a bit eccentric from the hinterland that remains really a bit more isolated. You don't really have much of a, say, local political power that grows after the Albigensian Crusade to significantly make it alone, right? It was about the northern French control that very often during the 100 Years' War could not afford to protect the south, that suffered some terrifying devastation. Think about the ones of the Black Prince of Carcassonne, etc. Plague, also trade routes were as a consequence taking other paths, etc. There is also evidence, interestingly enough, about the fact that southern France, like Italy, was one of the first regions to adopt new types of sharply pointed thrusting swords. The reason being, starting from the mid or late 13th century, the necessity of thrusting in the joints of plate armor that was spreading importantly. And the reason why we can observe it in countries like these is because of the military, of the arms and armor production, likely. So naturally, Italy, Lombardy, but not only had the finest arms and armor production in Europe, but perhaps this French south being a bit, say, relieved from more direct military exactions, could at least invest a little bit, at least in arms, armor, technical stuff. And again, it's it's debatable, right? It makes sense when you start comparing it to other areas, but you do find at least this tendency, which may have to be to do with the maybe a higher degree of material availability per capita, right? Trusting sharply pointed thrusting swords, or not just because of the coat of blades coming around. There is some, broader penetration issue there, as we'll see now. In any case, because everything gets heavier anyway on the battlefield. Now, further militarization spread to a local level during the 14th century, particularly after the outbreak of the 100 Years' War in 1337. This is most noticeable in the cities. So again, the idea that there were these communal forces heavily armored, just because they had, on average, more material wealth, may have to do with at least an increase in the military significance of these centers. But again, they are communes, and they're not states as such. So they don't. This was, again, like a large city like Toulouse, for example, was a commune. Historically, it was the count there too, and this doesn't allow the communes to evolve towards something more enterprising, like conquering other cities, etc. This doesn't happen in southern France, right? As a consequence, because of the English chevauchée, other raids, etc., and the fact again that the Capetians, the Valois from the north, were were incapable at some point of protecting so far southern areas, that the rural areas began to militarize themselves too, or at least, what this means at best is they had some sort of militias that were more frequently into defending themselves than other places that didn't suffer as many raids, right? So nothing impressive just per se, but still, right? And especially, again, in this still fairly fragmented area that the northern French had also had the capacity of taming, but not necessarily of recompacting with a much bulkier substratum, right? So every community, every lordship, of course, was a bit on its own. So we can pass to some archaeological iconographic evidence, which is fairly interesting, considering the massive influence, especially from the southwest, from Spain specifically, and the Islamic world, because there is a lot of southern French art that shows this. And it's so evident, so frequent, so recurrent, that obviously it has to do with the still late Saracen presence around, and especially the contact with Spain, right? So together with the Moorish styles, etc. In the cloisters of the Abbey of St. Peter in Moissat, right, there are some interesting carved capitals. We are in the County of Toulouse. This works date to, say, the beginning of the 12th century. And you have different scenes. It's a bit useless to describe, but let's say there are, now these are biblical ones, by the way. There is a general purpose knife and a sword, right? Side weapons were always present, right? An interesting detail, however, is not always there, right, to be documented. We find downturned quillons that are essentially the arms of the crossguard in the sword, which, given the fact that they are early compared to later developments, in Europe suggest Spanish influence, because the Iberian Peninsula, you do find that in this part of southern France, right? Interestingly enough, you have broad-bladed spearheads, a war axe with a spike at the back. In the hands, in these scenes of Crusaders this time, similarly showing a link with the Iberian Peninsula, because there are such weapons, right? And even though they're used by Christians here, they probably show us, in fact, something that had been, it is not stereotypical about the infidels, right? So, but that had thus been absorbed just as a technical material influence from probably Arab Andalusia, right? This is fascinating because there you find it. I made a video about the 8th century heavy infantryman from that region, an impressive amount of axes in relation to, and very similar, especially to Middle Eastern ones, right? That you definitely find in the Islamic part of the Mediterranean that have made essentially this circle right passing through North Africa, and you find an important pool there in southern Spain. And it's fascinating that in southwestern France you do have part of this say absorbed as an influence. Then you have in a carved capital that depicts the entry into Jerusalem from the Count of Toulouse from the first half of the 12th century, and now preserved at the Musée des Augustins in Toulouse. A turbaned figure holding short-hafted axe with a half-moon blade. Right, this is definitely not a Northern European weapon, and it's instead common in Spain. So yet again, this influence from say the broad Islamic world, such axe may have found its way to the county of Toulouse from Sicily, or as far as the Middle East, also in this case, perhaps via the Crusades themselves. Consider that when we talk about the Normans, right, it's a synecdoche, but there were also many Occitanians among the ones that conquered Sicily from the Arabs in the mid-11th century. So you may have that way, right? Even though the bulkier influence is from Spain, that had by the way, a very advanced technical culture, right? There are some things in Spain that were developed very early in time, like as designs that maybe, let's say, very often are iconographic sources. Maybe there is some artistic license there, but that eventually would have developed in places like France or Italy much later. Even things like the Schaller, for example, the salad, or this kind of advanced stuff, right? And which at some point disappeared there, especially when the Christians reconquered the Muslim era. So it's, of course, different weapons, different armor types can develop in different places, independently, and or at least not decisively stimulated by one another at some point, because designs are always out there, and technology is somehow out there, even among very far away fringe realities. The point is, what need you have specifically to develop that, which also in this case may have to do again with overall for a slightly lighter type of warfare that we will keep observing also in some of this evidence now. We have on the door of the church of Saint-Aventin in the Duchy of Gascony, dating to the late 12th century, a carved relief about the arrest of Saint-Aventin. So this is Saint Aventinus, displaying what are probably and remarkably accurate in this sense representations of the Islamic fighters of Andalusia. in fact, according to the same geography, Saint Aventinus had been arrested by the Moors as a Christian bishop, and this relief carving is just telling the story. So they had more than one reason to show the actual Moors. The artist clearly drew upon his own or local knowledge of those Muslims that were at that point just 300 kilometers away from Gascony. The warriors here are represented with baggy trousers. In one case, a headcloth recalling definitely the litham or veil that is still worn by the troops of Berber Saharan origin in the Iberian Peninsula. One has a small round shield, which is also very much connected with lighter type of warfare, the fighting a lagineta, etc. And another, a single-edged sword without quillon, so some kind of lighter, probably slighter, maybe even cavalry oriented type of weapon. And in fact, the latter features often among North African weaponry at this time. Both warriors appear to wear a relatively stiff garment over their loose trousers. This may mean that we're looking at a semi-rigid leather felt protection with armor. It's always complicated to look from carbon because, of course, we have no sense of what kind of construction material this is supposed to represent. But we have Spanish Mozarab manuscripts that show this kind of leather padded armor, which are pretty similar to this depiction, so it could be it. We have a representation of the siege of the city of Carcassonne in a relief carving from the county of Toulouse in the church of Saint-Nazaire, Carcassonne, right? And interestingly enough, here we find quite varied swords. There is the pointed, tapering version that is somehow early, right? You have the blunt-tipped and almost non-tapering one that is also connected a bit with the, again, lighter, kind of softer opponent. You find it in, say, in the Mediterranean, at least mostly from the Islamic side. That was less feudal than the northern shores, and often also poorer materially. These extremes, also a different chronology compared to the normal Western European one, suggest, again, probably that Spanish influence and mix that was, again, quite varied and articulate, especially in the earlier times. Fascinating, for example, is a weapon with acutely downturned quillon and a long langette that is, in some swords, basically an extension of the guard, located on both flats of the blade, and that is normally designed to fit tightly over the mouth of a scabbard and prevent accidental unseating. This particular sword looks almost Islamic. Right, it could be an import from Al-Andalus, even. It could, however, still be, again, symbolically used to show the wickedness of the represented character because of the, in fact, association with a foreign, in this case, heathen Muslim culture, and this is definitely interesting. There are other actually fascinating details in this works. We find a crossbow, very well illustrated from this time, the mangonel, right? That is one of the earlier representations in Western European art of such siege weapon. It's the simple manpower type, which had been in common use all around the Mediterranean since at least the early 12th century, but probably much earlier, right? This stuff was introduced to a degree by the Sino-Avar culture, like with way before, in the early Middle Ages. We have at the Cathedral of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, from the late 11th century, a carved capital showing a demon. Interestingly, a crossbow, an early form of crossbow, is in the hands of such demon. Right? These are the same years in which the papacy is attempting, as people think, generally speaking, to control and limit the use of such devastating new weapon. It's not entirely correct. I mean, most of these papal concerns for the weapons were not much for the weapon itself, but who would use it, right? Because this was an anti-cavalry weapon. Principally, at least would develop, especially from within the communal infantries, to, in fact, to obstacle cavalry and, causing horrendous losses within its ranks. So that's a bit more the idea. And more archetypically, you find, of course, the missile weapons that were actually used this side once, even by the knights, including the crossbow, much more frequently than it's actually depicted. As the weapon of cowards, right? The true hero goes and kills directly in hand-to-hand combat, etc. So somebody who has to shoot from the distance is thought of like of a coward, right? And even if these weapons always exist and are used by the same knights and know perfectly how to operate them, still the idea is that, for obvious reasons, also the best way to fight, if you can afford knightly training, equipment, etc., of course, to fight is shock cavalry. So it's mostly the sense that this is also the weapon of lesser people in form of commoners, etc. So coming from the dirt, from the humans, the most fallen kind, while of course the knights elevate themselves in a heavenly fashion, right? So it's a bit of a stereotype. But of course, the reality of warfare, aside from chivalric models and ideals, was notoriously something else. Like, it was not something that was hidden, right? It's just what people began to think because it was written, but and nobody else discussed the thing. But we see that these weapons were around. Well, because that's normal, right? People at the time normally didn't write especially about these things, because they were so basic, banal. Everybody used crossbows at this point, so there is no conspiracy theory as today's lesser people like to believe, of course, because they miss heavily the necessary historical background to criticize these things. This carving provides also an interesting depiction of how such crossbows were spanned at the time, and there is a bulge at the base of the stock that is very similar to the one depicted in the late 12th century Egyptian manuscript by Al-Tarsusi, right? So here, of course, maybe similar technical solutions to the same problems for the same weapons, but still, right, a correspondence with some Islamic evidence, which may have been not just from Egypt, necessarily from the Holy Land, but from Spain, also in this case. Then we have at the Musée de Beaux-Arts of Limoges, and in fact from the Viscounty of Limousin, dating to the early 12th century, some relief carving coming from the facade of Notre-Dame de la Règle, showing interesting helmet types. One specifically is conical and perhaps segmented, right? It may have a broad rim, but this could equally represent a cloth wound around the helmet. That is also something you find among the Moors and other infidels. It may have been, again, a souvenir of some Occitanian crusader that but also for other practical purpose you could use this stuff to adopt on his own. And the end of a headcloth, in fact, clearly hanging down the man's back, right? So especially you don't need to go to the Holy Land to feel very hot, right? And there were ways to shelter your body, right, through surcoats, other veils, and so on, in order not to receive all that heat that the metal would unavoidably absorb under the sun. And southern French summer is definitely hot as well. Not as hot as in the Levant, but sometimes it can be terrifying. You have examples in Northern Europe in which soldiers, of course, had to take their armor off because in summer it was definitely terrible to fight like that. So this appears as a topic in some recent sort of humanist discussions, but I don't think there is much of a complication. At least, okay, maybe I will make a video on my own on those topics because it's interesting to respond sometimes as well. We have a bit of a puzzle here. Some ivory chessmen preserved today at the Bargello Museum in Florence, dated to the 12th century, but a bit more difficult to localize. Some think that they came from southern France, but others think that they could be Sicilian, Eastern Mediterranean, or Byzantine. Even now we'll explain why. Because it essentially shows these warriors all together, as a broader set, what would likely be a Moorish, Saracen, or Byzantine equipment. So that's why people point also to southern Italy, but some say even more far away, right? There is some Middle Eastern influence as well. And at this point, fundamentally, yes, you have Sicilian art getting a lot from some Arabic influenced, artistry. But aside from the strong context with the Holy Land, at this point you also have a Byzantine substratum. And in fact, there is something about this equipment that looks definitely more European to some degree. For example, the length of one man's tunic, the finger draw used by the horse archer, make Middle Eastern origin unlikely, right? Because at that point, Seljuk equipment was prevalent and didn't display any of this. There is a warrior using a spear, perhaps a javelin, and a large round shield that at this point it's not very typical of Europe in the first place. The decoration recalls the silk-bound spiral cane shields of the Middle East in this case. The horse archer has a recurved bow of likely composite construction and a quiver that is interestingly showed on his left hip, which should be the other way around, as he's turning his saddle to shoot over his horse's rump. So again, this does look something like either North African or Byzantine to some degree, right? So some sort of lighter exotic equipment, distant from the Frankish military culture of mainland Europe, but possibly influenced, in fact, either by some Islamic or Byzantine styles, and evidently represented just as such, right? This chess set is evidently made in the sense that it's complexively about the style, right? Not about, say, one player has just the Western-looking guys and the other the mostly Islamic one. No, it's all one. We have an interesting wall painting now lost at the church of Poncet in Sarthe in the county of Maine, dating to the mid-12th century. We know of it from the records in the Service des Monuments Historiques in preserved in Paris. And here, among the various things, we notice an Islamic type of... when I say more Saracen to distinguish, I really mean more like the Spanish, Moroccan, say, guy, and say Saracen in a more kind of central Mediterranean, North African, even Egyptian sense, even from the Levant, etc. And styles were similar in that kind. And this this guy wears in the painting a long-sleeved male hauberk, while at least some of his fellow compatriots seem to have a helmet with a rectangular neck guard. Right. This is interesting because it is to be seen in this fashion in late 12th and early 13th century Iran. Right, so another indicator again of, here we are in Maine, right, so it's all, yeah, it's still Occitania, but fairly north in France, right, so this is yet again interesting because God only knows how they came up with that idea, but evidently this guy is supposed to be a Muslim, and whoever depicted him maybe had something very specific in mind, even from warriors came from very far away, right, from Persia. In this case, we have another wall painting at the Cathedral of Le Puy in the county of Auvergne, dating to the mid-12th century. We find 4 round shields placed in the hands of some infidels of some sort, and of course such decorations are dramatically similar to those seen in Islamic art. Right? They may be yet another Crusades inspired style that again was applied to Muslim troops represented. So you understand how repetitive this pattern really is, because we have seen it also in other regions, right? But you never quite understand so clearly what is supposed to represent, let's say, the Muslim with this lighter equipment, or what is perhaps a real thing locally. For example, in Spain, it's not entirely clear, right? And it's more shaded. This is interesting. While it's possible that southern France be more chivalric, more, again, artistically versed, less brutal. Say, like in the Iberian Reconquista, it would be but more interested in singing a bit the deeds of the Crusades by differentiating more about this archetypal enemy that was also well known through past history, the Crusades in the region, etc. And having here more representation of that, because that's also how you have to reason, right? There likely was some important material reflection of this in reality, right, as well in southwestern France, because again it's something we see in Spain too, and so we realize that there is a sort of land bridge here that does connect this, say, southwestern Europe with that part of the Islamic world, and Spain really does have that powerful emanation power. We can look at something more different just from Islamic influence. We have the carved capitals from the cloisters of the Church of Sainte Foy at Conques, in the county of Toulouse. This dates to the end of the 11th, beginning of the 12th century. We have probably here yet another Spanish influence, that is the lack of visible armor, right, worn by 3 warriors. We found that also in other videos for Spain. The sword belts are crudely carved, yet they are somehow normal. The 12th century, not the time. During the late 11th and early 12th century, many of the northern French warriors still hung their swords from baldricks, right? and two forms of shields are represented. One is the standard kite-shaped form you find all over Europe. Then a flat-topped kite-shaped shield, right? And the latter style normally does not appear until the mid or even late 12th century. This may have to do with the necessity of employing these shields also with greater coverage among infantry for some reason, maybe a more missile fire because of communal infantry, and maybe that kind of peppering hit-and-run tactics more similar to Spain. This is not to say that it could have not been a cavalry shield as well, but there is that tendency, right, of forming a shield wall by interlocking the shields that when they are curved, it's not that easy to do. It speaks more of an individualism for better armored people. Right. The helmet forms are also interesting. And among these we find a simple conical one without a nozzle. And another one that is really fascinating because it's a very early representation of the forward angled crown type, as well as a nozzle coming down from rounded brows that are thus reinforced like on the ridge, like the helmet just above the eyes. And in the representation, this helmet is actually slung onto the back of the head, perhaps for greater comfort, because this is evidently a heavier type of some sort, or at least conceptually, and never underestimate how uncomfortable it was to wear this stuff on a prolonged, especially during a struggle, a stressful situation, etc. We have some relief carving at the west front of Notre-Dame de la Coultre at Parthenay in the county of Poitou, dated to around the 40s of the 12th century. These carved figures here are very damaged by time, but there are some interesting and somehow surprising features to be seen here. There's a sleeveless surcoat worn over male hauberks that is not widespread in France until the late, say at least later on during the 12th century. Also, these hauberks have very wide sleeves, and it's bizarre because normally this, say, armor was designed, not just anatomically, of course, but just to be ergonomic, to be very, if not adherent, at least to not to have this excess. And it's been hypothesized that the reason why these sleeves, that are naturally, again, this can be an artistic license, but they may have to do with some influence from contemporary civilian costume, and because we do have other instances of armor being styled after this, right? For example, the Phrygian helmet, at some point, somebody thinks that it may have been in part to some sort of civilian style, but I think it was also to deflect better blows in general. But again, both would do. In this case, it's difficult to say what's the functionality of this. A shield is almost kidney-shaped, which is the typical type that you find in Spain among lighter cavalrymen, up to very late in Iberian warfare, that had to do with, again, hit-and-run tactics, the fighting a la Uneta, but it remains just as a design later also for relatively lighter, heavier forces, right? And again, Spain, this is not a coincidence, right? And this tells you again how influential the Iberian Peninsula was, at least for this region in Europe, for southern France. At the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, we have a carved capital from Notre-Dame de la Coultre, Parthenay, in the county of Poitou, also from the same time, the 40s of the 12th century, representing the soldiers of the high priest. The reason why this is connected with the 1-4 is not just it's the same thing, but it shows very wide sleeves on the tunics worn by apparently unarmored soldiers. So again, the idea that there could be some civilian connection, or at least that this was the type of clothing that was common, at least to be represented like this, makes sense as far as the male with long sleeve. While swords are also a bit different because they are apparently asymmetrical or reversed curved, right? This may have to do again with a specific artistic license in order to depict the wicked, right? So the idea of these guys are Islamic, coming from say Andalusia, etc. So they must be represented like that, but still with the sense of again sort of sabers and kind of more kind of skirmishing hit or run tactics, etc., lighter weapons, and so on. From the carved tympanum of the west front of the Church of Saint Foy at Conques, Recount of Toulouse, and this is sometime before, like either the 20s or the 30s of the 12th century, you find a one of the horsemen represented that is probably pride falling right from the horse. You can observe mid-length sleeves in an integral male coif. Right, the hauberk is also slit to the sides. This is somehow old-fashioned considering the chronology. There are two devils brandishing legitimately infernal weapons. One is a pickaxe. The other one is a rare illustration of a ball and chain. Now, naturally, this weaponry seems really, horrific, just for the damage they can do. Pickaxes were used against armor. We find them. We've seen them even in. They were there as can openers in the video about the King Arthur Legion, the Modena Cathedral reliefs in a very Western context. This thing of the ball and chain is also this has nothing to do with Islamic influence or whatever, nor the pickaxe, but it's still a very strange type of weapon to be seen, especially brandished by a single guy, right? This massive balls would have been used in some sort of siege context, like attached to some machinery or thrown at the enemy, something like that. So the art is also doesn't tell us anything in terms, anatomically speaking, how this weapon could be brandished, because the figure is little, somehow, not represented in scale, etc. But this stuff, surely, if thrown against somebody, wasn't particularly healthy for the guy. Let me tell you, and it may have been represented in a sort of symbolic sense, like still as a terrible, unusual weapon, at least for a single guy to use like that. We find also manuscript evidence, and there is a Beatus commentaries on the Apocalypse from Saint-Sever, Duchy of Gascony. Here we are pretty early, possibly even from the 20s of the 11th century to the 70s. In spite of the fairly crude imagery or representation, everything fits a general Western Frankish military profile. The only unusual feature is an early version of falchion, specifically. So a single-edged sword with a curved cutting edge and often angled back, right, for some extra use. Interestingly enough, this early type has no quillon or pommel. In some respect, it looks similar to a cut-down glaive or bill. The only difference is that it's properly a falchion, meaning that the blade broadens rather than tapers from the hilt. So, for the rest, the weapon is not strange to the Middle Ages, but the chronology, right, is the one that makes you think it could be, because again maybe there was a slightly softer type of armor around. I mean, on average, and this could mean that more chopping weapons were out there, more frequent. But again, here the statistical, it's just because of the chronology. We don't know how widespread these weapons really were. We don't have any other mean indicator. We have a depiction of a Moor slain by a Christian knight on a carved frieze of the west door Cathedral of Angoulême in the homonymous county. The interesting aspect in the Christian victor and defeated Moor represented is that they wear the same kind of armor, and it may represent mail, right? It does show scales on it, but the entire design doesn't suggest what is represented here. It's scale armor, right? Because here we find a coif, which would have been at that point historically unusual for scale. You have scales. You have armor here beneath the armpits, which would have not been the case either. The almost all known scale armors have flap-like sleeves, right, which only protect the outer part of the limb, right? So as far as we can see here, it's open. We have to think it was still showing such type of armor, which is also a slit at the side through which the hilt of the sword protrudes. All right, and the weapon is supported beneath the hauberk. Speaking of the Moor slain, he carries a conventional round shield, conventional for him, all right, in the sense that it was at least a lighter equipment connected with the entire concept of this shield. I made a video about medieval shields just recently, which I explain a bit these things. The helmet of the Moor is also interesting because it has a slightly forward angled crown, an apparently fluted surface, plus what could be an extension at the back to protect the neck, right? So something almost classical to some degree. And bear in mind that in Spain we do find around this time something very similar to, at least in the way it's depicted, to a sallet, way before it would spread elsewhere. So maybe it has to do with this. Maybe it's just an artistic license. We have a relief carving in the entrance steps of the Church of Saint-Gilles at Saint-Gilles-du-Gard in the county of Toulouse, dated to around 1145. The carvings here are similar in style to the ones of northern Italy, right? And we find a composite bow that is somehow not strange to find in the county of Toulouse. This weapon has angled ears, so even here some sort of possible Eastern influence, because you know that essentially the Byzantines and the Muslims had composite bow, while in Europe bows have always been made in the same identical way. So this is definitely a bit of an Eastern touch as well. We have the struggle of vices and virtues in the carved capitals of Notre-Dame-du-Port, Clermont-Ferrand, in the county of Auvergne. Here we find a sword protruding through a slit on the sides, like also one is found at Mossad. However, there is a much larger, broader shield here. This is fascinating because it seems definitely more suited for infantry combat than mounted one. As it's represented, we find this type of shield also in the hands of foot soldiers in a Norman carving of a slightly earlier date. could be a sort of anti-missile solution for, again, the less armored infantry in general. This is a specialized infantry shield, and infantry was on average lighter, even though, again, the shields could be used by knights and dismounted ones as well. And it could speak of this maybe higher level of skirmishing in southern France compared, say, to the north. We find in some frontier areas exposed, especially to nomadic warfare, this lighter one. Of course, the need of protecting yourself better from missile, when this is the case. We find a non-tapering sword of the broad Mediterranean form, again something mostly to be used against without the need of sticking into particularly heavy armor. So this would point to a different direction from the taping and pointed sword current in northern, say, broad Frankish art. We find fluted conical helmets with a nasal and lower rounded form without a nasal, such as some evidence at Saint-Nectaire. There are doubts regarding the realism behind this representation, because whenever we see that something represented in a bit of clumsy or incoherent way, we may think that the artist who represented this doesn't have much of an idea of what this actual stuff would have looked like, right, in person. So of course there are varieties and things we're discussing here that may have not been a thing, right? But consider that, again, we don't have this overwhelming evidence otherwise of the whole picture, especially for lighter types of armor, etc. So these sources are priceless. And there are enough, of course, throughout all Europe. You understand that I make this hours-long videos for every region, but overall there are not so many, right? I pick at least also the ones that are more meaningful, but overall, yes, you can make a PhD on a single, as an archaeologist or or history of art, whatever, on these regions, but it's not infinite. Like, once you've done that, you've exhausted it. We keep finding stuff, but they keep finding it, because I mean, let's leave that to archaeologists. That's our sadistic factionalism about this. Saint-Nectaire, that we just mentioned, it has beautiful carved capitals. We're in the county of Auvergne, late 11th, early 12th century. In this church, we find a pretty complete picture of, again, biblical imagery with, of course, military equipment inside. We see in these carvings that are representative of the rich Arvernian Romanesque of the time. These massive churches, monasteries, etc., especially in this region, are very powerful, like ecclesiastical lordships. Some definitely interesting evidence. This was a sort of cultural frontier between the north and the south, right? Bit of a hybrid with Burgundy, with also north of the Loire, and so on. And you definitely understand that this period, late 11th, early 12th century, is a period of change, technologically, among the other things. We see a lot of helmets, especially lots of different ones. We find low dome types, apparently of two segments, joined along a central comb and strengthened by a wide rim. Now, what is interesting about this model is that it likely descends from late Roman helmets, right, that had survived in design and structure in this era, right? And there is nothing strange about that, right? Because also there aren't so many ways you can make a helmet. Nothing, not everything has to be so immediately updated and, just more or less effective just because. It depends on materials, it depends how many you have, who are the troops wearing this, what for, right? So we do find archaisms as well as more updated things. We find conical segmented or fluted helmets with nozzles, which have to do with, say, probably an imitation of the conical helmets of northern France that, however, were slightly simpler in construction. So probably these are variants we're trying to update, but still maintaining some of their tradition. There is a similar form without a nozzle, worn by an unarmored horseman, which is the one of the Apocalypse, by the way. Most male halberds have mid-length sleeves. They reach only to the upper mid-thighs, which is not much. At this point, we're becoming longer, which may suggest, again, a lighter type of warfare in general. Right? This was heavy cavalry, evidently, but all this stuff, like this armor, does cost, right? And you can effectively you can consume much less energy, even for, say, a few tens of centimeters of mail more or less, right? This is important. A very interesting feature of this mail set is that they have an integral coif with ventails across the lower part of the face, which is also fascinating. It may have to do with some greater missile fire as well, a bit like in the East, right? But not only, because there is a debate regarding how this ventail was actually used or designed. There are some mail-clad warriors in two Catalan Bibles and in the Anglo-Norman Bayeux tapestry that show this square shapes shown below the throats. And so what we see in this sources are like this ventail hanging down from the chin, also in different images in the source. A roughly rectangular shape, again, probably being exactly that. Some think that instead this square shapes below the throats have to do with, they're actually chest doubling, right, on male, right, which could also be, or they could be both at the same time, right, because there are advantages and disadvantages in both. Right now, the idea of protecting your chest, say, from hit directly is important. Something penetrating your face could be the same, but you need more visibility. And generally speaking, Westerners do not use a lot of ventail at this point. So the idea is that, of course, they could have worn it, but when more missiles were around, rather than for heavily armored cavalry frontal clash. Even though later on the helmet would enclose the face as well, but you realize that up to that point it had been remained largely open, right? So this is also, we will talk about this perhaps in depth in some other video. The shields are essentially kite-shaped, swords are broad and straight, with round quatrefoil nut-shaped pommels. One is carried beneath the hauberk. There is, again, always the hilt protruding through a slit in the mail. Another is instead carried from a knotted sword belt. We see even two war axes, both with half-moon blades, right, that remind you of that Islamic influence. One of these axes have a spike at the back, right, so just like the one in Mossack and others in Spain. This was an extra, like, hitting, tool, and we do not see it in Northern Europe as a northern than here. fundamental. It was at least not characteristic, right? Because there were there too. We find in here a glaive-like hafted weapon, which has a long, apparently single-edged blade. The haft is not well represented, so we have no idea overall what it could look like. But of course, there was plenty of these hafted weapons also for infantry, etc., that we see less. It just existed in a great variety and with a lot of ingenuity of what they had, right? We find from the aforementioned ivory chess set at the Bargello Museum in Florence the representation of a knight surcoat, right, with large flat top shield, and his horse may wear some sort of limited form of caparison. So again, something not, say, has this kind of lighter type of warrior, like a shield that is in part more designed to contrast missile, again a comparison that is just limited as well to paradox, because also that had a cost in terms of heat, mobility, whatever. So even if with more missile fire around, if that's the right interpretation, it was still maybe just for economic reasons more convenient just to have. And the helmet is rounded and low domed with a substantial rim. It may be constructed as a sort of Spangenhelm with segments beneath a large cross-shaped frame, which is also somehow not anachronistic, but it's crude in the way it's conceived, at least and depicted here. Finally, there are some wall paintings depicting the Roman de Tristan and Iseult, or Iseult as it's spelled sometimes in French. This dates to perhaps even as late as the early 15th century, but people think it may be from the mid to late 14th century as well. This is located at the Templar chapel in the castle of Saint-Fleury in the county of Auvergne. Yeah? So this is the latest sources we show, because most of the evidence is, say, the strange type is from the previous century. So with probably again that proximity with Spain and more, say, Islamic influences that are somehow erased when the Reconquista succeeded in its job. For the rest, say, southern French warfare is pretty, again, Frankish, pretty Western. Here we find these Arthurian knights represented, however, in a very old-fashioned way, especially if the later we date these paintings, because the helmets are the last form of the pointed great helm, which, as you understand, even just in shape, was the last stage before the bassinet. That, at least, it's different from the great helm even in the skull design, but it's still somehow following the principle. In fact, one of these helmets seems to have a movable visor, unlike most great helms, and so again, something more pig-faced, like the bassinet. And I made videos about this, like in 14th century warfare, especially the one at Frankfurt Cathedral of the Antiking, and we do have bassinets shown as well. We see splintered arm defenses, a plated elbow protections, mail gauntlets, possibly at least, and all the latter are in 14th century style. Definitely. Body armor is hidden by a relatively tight-fitting surcoat. Legs are fully plated with paulanes, greaves, and sambatons. So again, this follows completely what was by now prevalent, especially by starting from the legs, right? Plate armoring, right? Swords are definitely typical of the middle late 14th century. Spears are the only other weapons shown. Some horses have caparisons, but we do not know whether there was any barding in properly metal armor, which is something that began to appear in the sources of the just late 13th, early 14th century. Very often we don't understand again what is represented in these carvings and other, say, wall paintings or whatever it's supposed to be made of, right? Because also leather caparison, for example, or padded clothing, etc., was often colored, so you do not understand what it's supposed to represent. And then the barding also sometimes was colored, but you would see it better, but you would have the caparison over it, so you wouldn't quite see it, just like we see here, barely the armor under the surcoat, the body one. So this was a bit the overall picture. Nothing glamorous, but I think it's very interesting to see how Spanish influence, especially up to the late 12th century, this area really is, right? And Reconquista brings in some sort of Western Frankish thing that was already at the core, of course, of Southern French military culture, material culture, and that eventually takes over, so you don't find any other, also with the end of the Crusade, etc., any other particular Muslim influence, right? And this makes sense also because in timeline the Albigensian Crusade is at the beginning of the 13th century, so in a time in which, for example, the Crusades still had to end, but that, of course, these locals didn't have many chances to, well, in part they would participate to it still. In fact, one of the punishments for the Count of Toulouse was to go to crusade after having fought against the Crusaders, but let's say not as much, more as a florid, courtly occasion, or a power policy, or something that could simply leave substantial cultural traces also returning from the Crusades, right? We don't find that more than much, so it's definitely a thing worth noticing. And we will keep talking naturally about Southern French warfare because it's very overlooked, right? Also, the video about the Kingdom of Arles is, say, Kingdom of Arles warfare, right? Burgundy Arles is in that direction. You see a fragmented reality where, however, some characteristic traits emerge. Needless to say, the Kingdom of Burgundy had more German influence, for example, more Italian influence. Here, southwestern France, again, it has a lot of Spanish influence. There's no doubt about this. But you never finish to learn. We'll look at all different types of single armor set, and various types of also of combinations, because we can also improvise, like saying, here we see an armor, here a helmet, here a type of sword, etc., and we can combine them sometimes. I already made some videos that function a bit like that, and it's funny because, of course, that's what happened at the time for real. In fact, when you look at these pictures, you realize that aside from the art, that could be very, let's say, very, very, in fact, licentious, let's say, there were very different styles, combinations, types of, of property of designs, of structures. So you realize, of course, that this stuff was not standardized, right? It was becoming dramatically standardized to the degree in which the most updated armor was, but very often that's also the only one we see. If you look at the details, you'll really find lots of other interesting stuff, even in the broader connection definitely to the average, right? So I think like you never stop learning about the stuff. There is always yet, first of all, another region to make for the videos. That really never ends. But in general, there is really so much to see, even within every single place that you say, okay, we'll watch it sometimes, but still, is there something else? Yes, there is always something else about the same thing, and the history is always like this. Well, alright, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I always thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time. Bye.